right, let's go next.
Welcome, everybody.
Oh. Well, maybe
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our favorite workshop. We're going to start off with employee new hire. Chief Clancy?
Good evening. We have a little larger than usual group to introduce tonight. These are our newest officers right here. We have Nicholas Ramos, Caroline Combs, Kevin O'Quinn, Sterling Warren, and I want to say Tyler Perry, but
Tyler Perry.
Dylan Perry. I'm sorry about that. Hey, this allowed for me to get all these straight at one time.
I was impressed.
I was going right on my hand. But they're all our newest officers. The four, as you see, are in the academy uniforms. They're doing the first part of the academy that we do here at the department. And tomorrow is their last pre-test. Once they finish that test, then they'll have to go up to the academy, take a cumulative test from all the things that they've done so far, and then run the physical agility course. And then they'll be put into a class and get started. And Nick he just joined us last week, so we have two more we're swearing in tomorrow, and one next week who's already certified. So we're getting our numbers back up, and they're working hard up in the upstairs and watching a lot of videos and sitting through a lot of classes. But they're doing very well on their tests. So
They look like they're dressed like the chief's inmates. That's what I thought you were doing. I thought we were doing a bond hearing or something.
Yeah.
This is what the
A
state
ship,
takes.
like a Coast Guard. They look like coasties.
Well, just a note on them going to the academy. If you remember, for a while it's been a big problem getting people into the academy. Since the academy switched to this new system where they do 4 weeks a year before they go to the academy, the backlog is officially gone.
Oh, wow.
They started out having to put classes through with in the low 70s to try to get through that backlog. This coming week, or actually last Sunday, they were scheduled to have a class, and up until the Wednesday before, they didn't have enough people to go in it, and they weren't actually sure if they were going to start the class, but they ended up, they got 39. So the system has been working very well, and it's getting people through there. So instead of them sitting around twiddling their thumbs for 3 months waiting to get in, they'll complete their training here, and then probably within a week or 2 weeks, they'll be in the academy.
So how long will they be in Columbia?
They'll be in Columbia for another 5 weeks.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank
you.
You're all going to come through with shining stars because he needs you. And good luck. Public Works Department.
Good evening, everybody. We got two new employees. Norris Bledsoe is our new stormwater supervisor. He's coming from Beaufort County with over 16 plus years of stormwater experience. He's originally from Beaufort, grew up with St. Helena. He's got a wife and 2 kids out there. He enjoys basketball. I'm from Florida, sorry. You guys on St. Helena. That's all right. And with his wife and 2 kids, and he enjoys playing basketball and outdoor sports. Stephen Cadis is coming to us to be in our facilities and traffic division to help out with Al and Frank a little bit. He was originally from Beaufort, come back from Charleston. We snagged him up, and we're going to get him in there, get him trained up, get some help for the Al and Frank. He enjoys fishing, spends a lot of his off time fishing, and when he's not doing that, he's watching the Cowboys.
So we fish, we play basketball, and watch the Cowboys.
Yeah, I like all those details.
Pretty good profile. Welcome, guys.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to Florida. Have a good
Thank you.
Okay. Presentation, MKSK Corridors Evaluation Report, review of the track. Welcome.
I don't know, that's what I was asking. There may be the printed copy of his report.
Got one.
It was in our package, right?
Yes, it should have been,
I
yeah.
think
It's,
it's that back with the pictures with the pretty,
hopefully they're
pretty,
pretty.
yeah. they're pretty.
I was trying to think of a personal anecdote, but wasn't able to do so in the last couple minutes. Actually, I do have something funny to tell you. I was, a few weeks ago, I was in a city not to be named, community not to be named in Jasper County, and it's a place that's experiencing tremendous growth. And so we're all sitting around the room, and it's like, you know, what does this place feel like? What's your identity? And this man steps up and says, you know what I think? I think it feels like we're Ohio's newest city. So I'm very happy to be here.
You were not in
one of
Tillman.
South
You were not in
Carolina's
Tillman.
oldest cities. I don't know Ohio anymore. No, so I'm very pleased to be here. And as you recall, I and two of my colleagues were in town back in November, and we conducted some field work. We gave a short presentation to you all, and we also solicited some feedback. And so I'm here to refresh you as to the goals, the intent of this project, and tell you a little bit more about what we heard from other stakeholders, and then talk about some preliminary recommendations that our team has for you to consider. So, and I do have a presentation that's slightly different format than the report, so if you'll just indulge me. So, again, the intent of this project was to evaluate a select set of commercial corridors, to look at their zoning in particular, and then to engage stakeholders, whether those are staff, elected or appointed officials, folks who are involved in the development community, to really sort of get an inside understanding of what's working, what maybe needs some improvement when it comes to zoning along those corridors, and then to provide some recommendations to you all in the form of a technical memo. So, you know, going way back, everything that we find in the Beaufort Code, it's all grounded in previous plans, and, you know, to cite one of many, the 2009 comprehensive plan, the principles of smart growth, the idea of Beaufort being a walkable community is something that's a high priority. And so we certainly understand that is something that even though we're talking about commercial corridors that in many cases were developed with the automobile in mind, there is a long-term vision of this community that's, you know, somewhat at odds with some of that existing reality. So, again, we were looking at select commercial corridors, and, you know, even within that, select areas within those commercial corridors. So, parts of Boundary, Rebo, Robert Smalls Parkway, Paris Island Gateway, and Sea Island Parkway are the areas that we examined. And I shared some of these graphics with you the other month. But needless to say, we did extensive field work, confirmed a lot of what we were able to glean from GIS and Google Earth, and essentially tried to characterize as best we could what these various corridors have to offer, and understand sort of how the existing zoning impacts and shapes what is there, and in many cases, you know, what is being built there, what is likely to be built there in the coming years. So, keeping all of this in mind, we heard a number of different ideas, comments from a variety of stakeholders, and so we've tried to capture that into just sort of not as a series of themes, but sort of as a collection of hot topics that were frequently mentioned in our conversation. So the first of those, and I think it led off every single conversation, happened to be literally the image that you're seeing in the middle of the screen, existing signage. What we heard from a lot of folks is that, our commercial signage doesn't necessarily take into account some of the corridor characteristics, so speed limit, number of lanes, when it comes to our zoning and sign regulations that allow for certain sign sizes and so forth, and that it's tricky to try to balance corridor aesthetics, creating this sort of walkable environment, or at least one that doesn't feel like it just caters to the automobile with the actual functionality of signage, which is, to notify the passerby, whether that person is on foot or in a vehicle, that, there is a business, a destination. And so we need to make sure that our signs are doing their fundamental job, which is to generate some level of awareness. And so how do we combine those two different needs, the community need and then the commercial need? The second big issue that we heard was all about lot coverage, and these are images that are from one particular building. This is on Rebo Road, and I'm not here to just pick on this particular development, but it was cited by several folks as, this just doesn't feel right. Like, we get it, but there's just something weird about sitting on a front porch, being 10 feet away from 40-mile-an-hour traffic. So, what does that mean for our current lot coverage standards, especially along those T5 UC corridors? Building requirements, this is something that we heard different strong opinions about. Some folks said, the standards that we have are great. They add to the character and the quality of the built environment. They meet our community's vision as a vibrant, walkable place. Other folks said, well, do we really need to have, you can see the example of the brake shop. Do we really need a brake shop that has, upstairs living, 2 stories? So we heard a variety of different opinions pertaining to building height requirements, and so we have some thoughts on that. Buffers and screening, one of the things about some of your existing buffer requirements, what they don't do is necessarily take into account the presence of utilities, which often occupy the same zone or trench area that trees and other vegetation would otherwise occupy. So, so we have the intent to have buffers and screening, but in practice, sometimes it's very difficult to accomplish given the underground infrastructure constraints that we have along our commercial corridors. This is slightly outside of our scope of work, the issue of housing and affordable housing, but we heard from a lot of folks that there may need to be an additional zoning category that occupies a space somewhere between T5 UC and T4N, and that classification would essentially limit some of the commercial, would require some less intense uses and height requirements, and maybe it's something that could also be used to encourage some of what's being called missing middle housing products. And so again, sort of the missing middle piece is a little outside of our scope of work, but again, affordable housing is something that popped up in our conversations again and again. And then just overall corridor requirements. We heard a variety of different ideas. You can see the site triangle diagram on the right. That was something that was cited by multiple city staff folks. We had other folks talk about traffic calming measures, about trying to create multimodal nodes along corridors. So instead of really focusing our efforts on the corridor as a whole, maybe we target an intersection or a collection of intersections to really try to create this sort of livable mixed-use space. And so, again, we heard a variety of different ideas related to corridor requirements. So our recommendations, and these are described in greater detail in the memorandum that you all have. When it comes to zoning, we do think you should consider some sort of middle zoning category that lives somewhere between that T5UC and T4N, because we think that it would create more of the character that people said they would like to see or have along some of those suburban corridors, so Boundary, Rebo, and sections of Sea Island Parkway. We have a diagram to illustrate this idea, but the idea of revising some of your lot coverage requirements for T5UC is something that you could consider. And what that would do is ensure greater room for landscaping, for buffers, for creating a truly pedestrian-friendly environment rather than one that essentially uses up property in a way that forces that pedestrian realm to the edge of the street. So creating some sort of livable space. Another idea, again, that's beyond the scope of this is to really dig into the idea of missing middle housing types as potential allowable uses in some of your neighborhood districts. And in particular, you see the T3, T4, HN, and T4N districts. And then just one other thing, which from our standpoint, even our team is divided about this idea, but the whole idea of maybe giving those zoning district names, changing the names, making them something that's, we all understand that this is a transect model that we're building off of, but it may make sense. And again, I'm sort of one of the folks on our team who doesn't necessarily think strongly that this is the case, but something that you could consider is changing the names of them if you feel that there's confusion from the development community. And Dave, I think you're much more tuned in to whether that's something that's worthy of further exploration. Regarding site design, we heard a lot about drive-throughs and how they work or don't work particularly well. So we think there's definitely a need to have additional dialogue, discussion, work with site designers, with developers, to make sure that that not just vehicular circulation, but pedestrian circulation is better, safer. And there are several examples that we could talk about where some of that consideration could certainly benefit the project, rather than just focusing on vehicular circulation. Another idea for projects that require traffic impact study or analysis, let's think about, again, more than just cars. Let's think about mobility. Let's think, if we're going to think about Buford as being a walkable place, let's think about the impacts of people walking and biking to a site. And again, this may or may not apply to a particular project, but if we're going to think about traffic impact, let's think about mobility impact. And then we have a diagram for this as well. Think about or consider revising your existing front yard setbacks to give a distance that's going to create a buffer that's going to allow for the vegetation that you want, that is going to allow for the utilities that need to be there, and to create a safe distance, nothing absurd, but a safe walking distance between the edge of the pavement and the pedestrian realm, whether that's a sidewalk or shared use path. And so we've got some diagrams illustrating that. I'll show you in just a moment. As far as building requirements, this is another sort of internal team disagreement. But the whole idea about your building material standards, you know, there's some of us who think that along some of your major corridors that some of those standards could be relaxed. Others, myself included, don't feel that that is necessarily something that you need to do. Again, all these ideas are sort of open for discussion and up to your discretion. A second idea to consider would be to remove the existing requirement for liner buildings along major corridors, which is self-explanatory. Another, which is, you know, kind of internally controversial for us, is to remove that existing front yard entrance. I think a compelling case can be made in cases where that front yard entrance may necessitate or require a significant sort of reorganizing of the space, of the interior space, such that it's not as useful or productive for that particular use. And then also to think about the heights of your new buildings to be 1 to 1.5 stories. Again, that's going to depend on the use of the building, and frankly, even it should depend on where that building is along a corridor. So a middle section versus an intersection, that sort of thing. And then as far as overall corridor requirements, we think it's a great idea to think about these corridors as not just linear things, but a collection of nodes. You know, again, if we're trying to meet or fulfill the long-term vision of Beaufort as a walkable place, we need to be able to subdivide or sort of break up some of these long linear corridors and make wise use of some areas within them. Start to build some centers of gravity, if that makes sense.
Do you want us to hold questions to the end, or can we
I've
pass it throughout, or are you close?
I've got, let me just
Okay. No,
walk through this slide. Yeah, so put a pen in it. Another idea would be to create some overlays that incorporate different standards for multi-lane roads. Think about traffic calming measures, you know, when and where possible, which, you know, there's not necessarily a lot of real estate because we're surrounded by water here. And then to think about, and this is important, incorporating bike ped enhancements into your roadway and corridor planning efforts. So as you plan, as you build, keep that multimodal piece in mind. Another area of special emphasis would be the entryway. So we talk about the nodes. Entryways really provide you an opportunity to, you know, to welcome the visitor, to sort of say, you know, we are a special place. We all know that that is the case, but those entryways along your corridors can be useful places to place some special or heightened emphasis. One controversial idea would be that of the slip road. Again, slip roads, they chew up a lot of real estate. They are, in many cases, incompatible with an enhanced pedestrian realm, but there may be some locations where that is an idea that could be explored. And what that would do is that would enable you to reduce some traffic congestion along the main corridors, especially where you have larger or developments or redevelopment projects where you're going to have significant traffic volumes going to or, you know, from that particular development where a slip road may make sense. And then one last thing, and again, this came from city staff, you know, let's make sure that we're meeting our site triangle standards at all intersections. And it's less important at signalized intersections than it is that those that just have a traffic sign only. And so that's sort of a simple recommendation, but just something that's important to keep in mind. So just a few quick exhibits. So this shows your existing zoning. This is T5UC, I believe. So lot coverage, setback, and buffer. And you can see, I don't have a pointer. Oh, I've got a little arrow guy right here. But you can see with the sidewalk here that's flush against the edge of pavement, there's not room for a streetscape buffer. The front yard setback is, 0 to 15 feet. You have your front entrance along the major corridor, and then you have a secondary entrance along the back. And then if you sort of take this and turn it into 3 dimensions, you also have a 2-story height requirement, and then a 5-foot minimum buffer along the back with parking. So if we were to reduce that lot coverage to a maximum of 75 to 90%, and this is just for example, what you're able to get for that is a front yard buffer that enables you to have those utilities, integrate vegetation, and create that buffer that's truly going to create a great pedestrian, safe and pedestrian environment. So the sidewalk is pushed back. The setback, you can see that there's a range. And what we're showing in this is an option wherein that front entrance goes away. There certainly could be an option in which the front entrance remains, in which case the front yard setback would obviously be much smaller between the sidewalk and the front of the building. And what you're seeing here as well, given that there's only one entrance, that entrance is in the rear, and that there's a safe, wide walking path from the sidewalk to the entrance. And similarly, if that height requirement goes down from 2 stories to 1.5, it's just, you have a different sense of scale here. Looking at the existing front yard buffers, you see 20 to 50 minimum width. And this is only for certain corridors, right? And then existing zoning for a side and rear yard buffer, it's just 5 feet, so 5-foot minimum width. So if we were to take, to look at those side and rear yard buffers and just expand them out even to 10 feet, that 10 feet actually gets you a lot. And then one last thing would be parking lot landscaping and screening. So this would apply really only to T5UC when it's adjacent to T3, T4HN, or a county residential district. And so what you're looking at here is either a wall / fence or berm. And you notice that the width is 10-foot minimum. That's still not very significant, but it gives you some vertical screening. And this is something that we heard from quite a few people when we were here in November, that's an important idea and should be a priority. So I've really run through all of these in a hurry, and I appreciate you holding your thoughts. So I'd love to field any and all questions that you might have, and to the extent that I'm able to answer them, I will. I would like to reserve the right to say I'll get back to you, because we've intended for this memo to be an interim report, so we'll go back and we'll flesh out some key ideas for a final product. So with that, I'd love to open the floor.
Come back to me.
I think, I like all the recommendations. I mean, I went, I have notes, but I absolutely agree with the thing about the front door entrance. That I just think, I don't know, doesn't make sense to me, never did. I don't know where it came from. It would make the building more expensive, it would change the interior of the building, the layout. And how many people are going to use it? I don't think many people are. So, I like that. I like the buffer. With the example of ours on Remote Road, it does seem like there should have been somewhat of a buffer there. So I like that idea. The minor buildings, that was something I never really understood myself, the idea to not have them as a requirement. I like that idea. I like the front yard buffer on the side. The signage, your notes about signage I agree with, and then and something between the T5 UC and T4 in the middle housing. It was, I liked all the recommendations. I mean, I'm sure there'll probably be somebody disagree, but.
Well,
Thank you.
I like a lot of the ideas too.
Oh, wait, one more, and that two-story requirement.
Yeah,
I
that was
think
what I
that's
was gonna say. I
just-
like the 1.5 story.
I like the 1.5.
Although I think there are still elements and areas where 2-story is appropriate, but,
Like
yeah.
for example, at intersections,
Yeah.
signalized intersections, you don't have to worry about side
Side
triangle.
variation.
On boundary, we changed that
Yes,
already.
right.
We did, we softened it on that
It's 2 stories only required at the intersections.
at the intersection.
We've already done that.
Go forth.
You done?
I mean, I'm gonna chime in again, I'm sure.
Well, thank you. I think you've given us a lot to think about. I guess I want to start with, I think we ought to be very careful in what we undo, because we spent a lot of time, we spent a lot of energy, and no offense to the T, but the process that we engaged in the form-based code and the Beaufort Code committees previously was a much broader effort, which brought in a lot of other stakeholders, especially members of the public, besides council, staff, and property owners, right? So I'm not sure if we got a broad enough sample size of the public to say that this is the consensus of everybody. And that's acknowledging that you got a scope, right? I think in signage, we've had some conversations, and I think we have some guidance on what we're going to do to signage. I know that some of that's up later in the meeting. I think there's a disconnect between signage and the perception of the effectiveness of signage. That makes sense? Especially in this GPS world where most of us, if we don't know where we're going, we've got a Waze app or an app in our car, and I don't need a big blaring sign out there to tell me where I'm going. And I think increasingly so, we rely less on signage, especially in urban areas where densities are approaching a place where you're just not going to be able to put enough signs up for every business that's out there. In terms of the lot coverage, especially in T5 UC, which is our urban corridors, I also think that our lot coverage and our standards are important for a number of reasons. One, because we are trying to design and develop sort of an extension of our historic downtown and our historic towns, right? That's going to grow out of where our historic district is now. And if you look at our urban corridors, those are attached to that district now. And that district ought to be reflective of that walkable, mixed-use urban environment. So think about downtown. Buildings are up on the street. It's almost 100% lot coverage. When you walk out of the front door of the building or the stoop of the apartment, you walk right down onto the sidewalk and you access that sidewalk. So I think we ought to be careful about rolling back those standards in T5 UCs.
But remember, speed limits too. Totally different in the historic district and downtown. You got 2 lanes,
I really think you gotta talk about each of the corridors differently.
Yeah.
Rebo Road, is a little intrusive, but if it were a boundary street with the sidewalk, with the grass between the street, it would be very different. And I guess part of it is, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but part of it is the evolution of a corridor.
That's right.
And if that part of Rebo Road, that is the end of commercial, if I'm not mistaken, right before that, if that is to be built out to be more walkable to tie it in, then you'd have to have a different treatment in terms of your sidewalk, as opposed to Boundary Street, where you could be as close to that lot line as possible. In fact, we have some places where people maybe end up using the sidewalk as an extension 4 different elements. I think you have to talk about each.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, within each corridor even.
Yeah.
Within each
Right.
corridor, and I think you touched on that, within each corridor, you have a different development pattern. So 170 is a perfect example at the corner of 170 and 270 where we have the McDonald's. You know, that edge is very urban, and I think we hope that becomes a sort of a downtown Burton Village at some point with the addition of the Publix and the Lima buildings, right? Further down, we've got RMX zoning, which is where our Lowe's and Longhorn Steakhouse, and that's that traditional sort of retail where you've got that big flat lot parking lot, you've got some minor buildings, you've got a broader scope of signage. And so I think it's important that we realize the difference even of the respective corridors, that they will be developed differently.
That's right.
So I don't think we ought to paint some of these things with a broad brush. It's a nuanced approach. I also think in terms of building requirements, a second story or a third story isn't gonna kill anybody. And if you're familiar with Joe Menicosa's work about land use and economic farming, from a tax revenue standpoint, being able to add height adds tremendous value to the dollars per square foot of that site and what we reap long-term.
It also just saves land.
It also saves land, right? And so in a place where we have a finite amount of developable land, especially if we're serious about protecting the rural greenbelt around Beaufort, that means that we're gonna have to accept a little higher density in certain areas of town. And in these urban corridors where we've said in the form-based code, that's what we want to happen. I'm nervous about rolling back those requirements because I think whatever gets built there, we're stuck with for 50 years. And you can see some of the results of things that were built 20 or 30 years ago that I think we wish if we were able to do it over again, we might have done a little differently. So I urge a little caution on that as well. Buffers and screening, kind of the same thing. I think we ought to be cognizant of land use, and you know, I'm sensitive to the neighbors and compatible uses up against each other. That probably deserves a little further digging. I like the suggestion because I do think that T5 UC to T4N, it's a pretty broad jump, especially in certain areas of Ladies Island, like we've talked, David, that there needs to be a middle one with a little less density. T and I had a really good conversation about affordable housing and this missing middle product, and so I appreciate, even though again it was sort of out of the scope, that was encapsulated in your report, because I think, and I wish Phil was here for affordable housing. I think T brought up, we got to be a little more creative in the housing types and what we promote and what we allow, and not everything has to be a single-family home slab on grade, you know, built into a traditional neighborhood. And we've got some really perfect examples of multi-units, you know, 4 units within the historic district that look like great historic homes, but 4 families can occupy. The setbacks, you know, again, that's a tough one for me as far as the front building. I mean, if you look at the Outback, I told it's a pretty well-performing store in their franchise. People use that front door with the rear parking. I think from an aesthetic standpoint, when you drive down the corridor and you see people walking in and out of that front door and sitting on that front porch waiting, I think it creates a whole new sort of environment and ambiance versus if it was just a flat glass wall or maybe a fake porch, whatever we would force them to put there, and then everybody's coming in and out of the back of the building. So again, I guess there are a lot of nuances that we've created in our form-based code and in our Beaufort code, and I just urge a lot of caution before we start going and undoing some of those things that we spent years and years and many thousands of dollars in a very open and transparent, lengthy public process to put into place.
Well, I agree, but I also think that I wish there always needs to be flexibility. I think that, you know, we did the code, we did the Beaufort code, the urban planners come in and they say, okay, this is what we want the new urban planning to look like. And then already we've seen where we've had some instances where we've had some changes already, I mean, a few changes. And I just feel like with some of these ideas, which I think are good ideas, these recommendations, I think that even if we don't change the code, we ought to add some flexibility to it. Because the thing thing about the front door entrance, yes, I agree with you on Outback, but every situation on every corridor is different to me. They're all different, these buildings are different. In new buildings that might be built, there might be a building that we're gonna require to have a front door entrance that doesn't need that could have the side door entrance. But then you've got like Outback, which does work, that does work.
But my assumption is, if you look at that Outback, it's very different than most of the other stores within their corporation, right? Even the McDonald's, look at the McDonald's, and I know they were unhappy about what we made them do in terms of building a two-story building, citing it like we did, where we made them reorient their drive-through. But, you know, we all travel a fair amount. Look at what other stores are being built. Look at what those stores look like in other jurisdictions. And then look at the form that they take in Beaufort. And I think we ought to be very proud. Not to say that we do everything right, but that's a really nice looking McDonald's. And I think what's really important is that regardless of what sign is on that building, what name is on that building, you could take the McDonald's signage off that building and any other restaurant could go in there. It could serve another purpose. I mean, you've heard me talk about the Old Bull Tavern, and the pizza room was my great-grandmother's seamstress shop in the 1950s as Beaufort Alterations. Before that, it was a furniture store. Before that, it was a storage building. And how awesome that a 100-year-old building has served 10 different purposes over that 100 years. And that's part of the reason why we have this aesthetic and this form-based design pattern, is so that we don't let a Wendy's come in and build whatever crappy model they're building in Anywhere USA. We really want to sort of match the form and aesthetic that we've said this is the Beaufort style, risking building poor copies of old structures. So there has to be some flexibility, man. I totally agree with you. But I also think we have to be careful in what kind of flexibility we allow, because that use might not always be that use. But we're always going to be stuck with that building, at least until...
Well, I think y'all are saying the same things, actually, because the whole impetus of this was that we would revisit code, we would look at flexibilities, needs, and so forth, and I think looking at the specificity of the corridors to say, this works in this area, but really doesn't work in this area from the standpoint of increasing setbacks or increasing this and so forth. I think there's just the ability that you can look at different areas in the corridors and in different corridors and recognize that what we set in our Beaufort code works, but there may be areas that we can massage it to be better or be more influencing as far as the marketplace, without taking away the elements that we've already set into it that we work very hard on dealing with, so as well. But,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a bunch of interesting ideas. I think that Boundary Street is pretty much set, and that we ought to let it play itself out. We have had to make certain flexibility. We as we said, we got rid of the two-story requirement except on the corners. And as we look at other corridors, it'll be interesting to see when we look at Boundary Street from the tennis courts or from here to Bellamy Curve. Now, you have to look at what your built infrastructure is there and how much is going to change and whether you can afford to do everything you did on Boundary Street where you have grass, a wider sidewalk, and a short setback makes sense because you're on the sidewalk. You are part of the pedestrian mix. So I think it's important to do this. I think the reason was not so much to critique or to even do amendments, but to make us aware that one size doesn't fit all. That Sea Island, that baby boundary is going to be one thing, that Sea Island corridor is going to be another thing, that if Rebo Road at some point, when, you know, we're going to look at what happens between the Port Royal line at Burger King and Technical College and the hospital, probably nothing other than maybe making it safer to walk. And what will be a residential area is staked out as a residential area. So I think these are tools to say that there are other ways of doing things, but again, it's site specific. I mean, you know, when they plan Boundary Street or when they plan anything, they come up with a conceptual. and then they do survey work, and then the engineers dig in, and you realize that that's not gonna be, you're not gonna have the plan you wanted because it doesn't work. It doesn't fit. There wasn't room on the south side of Boundary to keep the multi-mobile modal path because you had gravestones that weren't, graves that weren't gonna be moved. So you had to adapt. So having these as considerations as we look to plan, which I'd hope the city would at some point, to look at Baby Boundary, to look at Sea Island Parkway, we can take this, lay it against Boundary, see how Boundary's working, and then come up with something that fits that dirt, that space, the built environment that is not going to go away, that is going to stay there, versus the opportunities for replacing buildings. And that's always a problem with the code. And corridors make it a little more difficult because they're supposed to be more diverse. Lifestyles here don't today look at upper story living or live works, if not work, very well today. But when you get to an area like Baby Boundary where we're going to see more walking, more biking, more activity around the university, then we look at that one and say, well, this doesn't fit, but it was recommended that we consider this. So it's sort of a palette to pull from. But I don't think you can really standardize when you've got the conflict between the built environment and redevelopment versus development.
Right.
And so I think it's a useful exercise because it will give us thought and maybe move along more quickly once we commit to taking any one of those several areas.
Well,
But I don't want to I don't want to immediately back off density because our goal from the outset was to compact it for purposes of saving land, not disturbing other land, using existing infrastructure, having more walkable, friendly neighborhoods. And a lot of the things that you heard are actually things that were heard, but not necessarily agreed to during the Boundary Street elongated 9-year process. It's probably many of the same people saying the same things, as opposed to McDonald's was very upset. The last time I talked to them, that store is performing, and the owner was very, very happy with it.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is I think, if I look at these issues, they're mostly issues that we have dealt with on sort of individual projects within the last year or so. And we've had individual property owners complain about standards. But I think if you look at the city as a whole, I mean, we just sent out a press release that said our permits and projects are double what they were last year. I mean, look at the Boundary Street corridor alone. Since the form-based code was put into place, we've had $20 million, $25 million worth of investment along the corridor. I mean, the Break Place looks great. Chick-fil-A is going gangbusters. He's getting ready to remodel his store so he can capture more business. So, I know there are a few folks grumbling about flexibility or grumbling about codes that are too restrictive, but some people are making it work. I mean, there's obviously confidence in the market to where we've got a new Spring Hill Suites, we've had a new Break Place go up, we've got Beaufort Town Center filling up. I mean, planning department's been running wide open, just trying to get permits out the door. So if we were at a time where, things were flat and people weren't investing in our city, I would maybe buy the argument that our codes were far too restrictive and we need to take a hard look at our regulatory processes. But that's just not the case. People obviously have market confidence and are willing to put their money into our city.
Those are all great observations. I appreciate your empathy.
It's not empathy.
Well, I guess empathy from the standpoint of the challenge of this project. There's one massive caveat to all of this, which I should have started out with, which is
What was the scope? Because candidly, I wasn't even aware you were hired until you were asked to come. We were asked to come sit with you.
Sure.
And so council wasn't aware why the consultant was brought in or what you were here to do.
Bill wanted, and I think you kind of mentioned, because
We
we're,
discussed,
Yeah.
we didn't discuss the contract, but we did discuss how we're gonna think for the future about additional corridors. You may not have been here that night, but if and what we can learn from Boundary, how it applied to other places. So not that we have the money or the time or the interest or the demands to do anything necessarily today, but to get ahead of the curve so that when we do decide we want to hit those, we will have had some forethought. So I mean, we did discuss that contract item.
yeah, I don't think Bill, when he thought it was a good idea, and I don't think he meant he was pitching these ideas to change the zoning. To your point, Stephen, like you mentioned, we get a lot of pushback from people, and he thought, well, let's have an outside party, look at this. And so, because we've been discussing it a lot, and he just thought it, and I don't think he thought he's pushing any one thing to be changed. I think he just said, well, let's look at it. We've gotten enough, kind of feedback that it warranted in his mind, and that's all this really was. And so, and it may be like, nope, we're good with what we have. I mean, just to have the conversation, because we've had enough kind of negative too, that maybe we should take a step back, and I think this is exactly what we needed to do, is say, here's some ideas, do we agree with them or not, or we want to stay with the course that we're doing? So I think that's all he intended from it.
And in terms of flexibility, if I remember that late night work session we had here with the McNair attorney, Walter Nestor, and the development group. I mean, remember, we were here till 11 plus o'clock at night, and I think there was a couple of those. And I remember in a number of the sections of the development code, in flexibility, I guess to answer your comment about flexibility, we kept saying blow-off valve. And I remember that in a number of sections, we allowed staff to have some flexibility in how the code was interpreted.
Percentage-wise.
Because I agree, once you, and to your point, once you go to build something and you find out what's under the ground or what DOT will let you do or not let you do, there's economics there and there's physical realities, and we got to work around that, especially in a city that's 300 years old. But I thought we put a lot of those relief valves, much to the chagrin of the Coastal Conservation League and Kate Schaefer at the time, in the code to provide some flexibility. Is that?
Well,
are you finding that, or?
Well, some of them, sometimes it works, it just depends, like the administrative adjustment is 10%. So let's say, like on T5UC, someone wanted to be back more than, it's 0 to 15 there. So you can be back another 1.5 feet. So that doesn't really, not much of a relief valve there. So some of the things, I think the relief valve that are in there is just so that we're not being ridiculous. Like, if it is 1.5 feet, we're not saying, well, you can't, it's gotta be 15 feet. That's silly, right? I mean, those aren't really design relief valves. Those are just like, there was a line there. We don't wanna make them move the line when we can just move the building 1.5 feet. So I think the relief valves are in there are more practical than they are design relief valves. So, I mean.
In terms of materials, did you guys talk about prohibited materials and what specific materials we might consider?
Yeah, I need to go back and look at our conversations,
Like the Olive Garden,
for example.
Lobster garden.
the lobster garden.
I need to get back to you on that. We had a long, email exchange over it. I mean, and this is what's really tough, and this is what I was gonna say is the caveat. The caveat is that this is a great community. I mean, you're doing so many things well. So please don't see this as us coming in, taking pot shots.
No, we don't.
Okay, good. And again, just based on the quality of design that we see, I mean, frankly, as an outsider, as a visitor, there's nothing wrong with any of that. But again, it's based on some of what we heard.
Well, I think you've captured many of the conversations that we've been
Okay.
having over the last 9 months between planning and council and the development community. So I think you've captured it. I'm not sure if you've answered.
No, well,
You've given me answers to my questions.
No,
and
no,
some
no.
of the others, but.
I didn't answer that question, but what are the other questions?
again, in terms of
What
the.
about materials? Weren't you on that one?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
materials and in
Distracted.
terms
I
of
was gonna say,
building
I need
heights
to-
and setbacks and those
Yeah,
kinds of
I
things.
need to
I'm
get
not
back
sure.
to you on the materials, because we had a whole internal discussion about it. We're gonna have a debrief tomorrow with Brad, who's unable to be here. Again, these are some ideas, these are some observations based on what we heard, what we learned, and some of what we saw when we were here in November. And, in balance, things are going very well here from everything that we can see and ascertain. So, please consider these, as some thoughts, some ideas that are, worthy of discussion as to whether or not, and none of these things are, one-size-fits-all solutions. And one thing I made a note to myself that in the final memo, what we'll do is we'll actually call out when and where some of these ideas or recommendations may be appropriate along parts of the corridor. So that's something that we'll make sure that we include as part of our final write-up. And then as far as, I lost my track. But just basically the idea that, we need to talk about and think about each corridor in a different way, even though they're all commercial corridors. They all have their own strengths, they have their own identity, so we need to be cognizant of that moving forward.
Cool. Any observations or questions from visitors? Yes, sir.
In the example you gave of the differences in setbacks, you have a couple of images.
Sure.
Yeah, those images right there. Have you done anything to develop what that would look like if you had a cluster of like buildings and like properties? Because I think a single instance gives you a certain picture, but when you group 2 or 3 or 4 of those together, what would that look like? I think that there's a certain amount of issues that would come up at that point.
Yeah, that's a great observation. The short answer is we did not prepare graphics showing that scenario. We were looking at just site-specific.
A couple of things. One, I never heard the word historic, and that always bothers me when there's a presentation by a consultant and they don't talk about historic preservation. You did talk about materials. I would have been really interested to hear what you said about that, because we're dealing with a lot of those issues. I would like to say that the great Robert Marvin always told me that the human body has a great reaction to buildings and to scale and to trees and the landscape. And that's what he tried to achieve in the waterfront park, that we have these subconscious feelings. I always felt the library was inappropriately turned its back to every main street that it surrounds, and it's never really, in my opinion, functioned in a really appropriate manner. I know, for example, Talbot's was forced to add a second entrance at a great cost, where if they'd been able to have a setback, you could have used the front entrance safely. But the problem was it sits right on Boundary Street. Nobody felt safe walking around at the front of that building to go in, traffic 5 feet away and going at a fairly rapid pace, and 4 lanes of fairly narrow lanes at that. So I think some of the ideas, certainly in the areas that have a historic setting, the Sea Island Parkway being one that I've been really concerned with lately, and it losing all sense of place and character. So I think those would be the main comments I would have.
Yeah, Talbot's, your point is well taken, but Talbot's was built upon the city's promise that they were going to slow down Boundary Street. And that whole string of buildings was predicated on Boundary Street being slowed down, more grass, more sidewalks, and it never happened. And which is, I keep going back to call
You
it,
know,
I
as
call
you're
it.
saying that, Mayor, it also reminds me that when you think of Boundary Street in the sixties and seventies,
Oh, yeah.
nothing was right up to the street. Everything had some setback.
Well,
And I
there's only
think-
2 lanes too.
Well, but still, you think in a small southern town, that's what you expect. You don't expect things to come right up to the street. That's always sort of bothered me about we're changing the whole concept of the way people live in these communities. And when you start breaking those kind of traditions, it's a subconscious sort of what's bothering me, what's not right kind of thing.
Essentially, if you go back further though, to historic downtowns, they weren't set way back with a giant flat lot parking lot. With the advent of the automobile and Euclidean-based zoning in the 1960s from Euclid, Ohio, that's where we separated everything, right? And we said, commercial's gonna be over here, residential's gonna be over here, and every time we wanna go do anything, we gotta get an automobile to do it.
Well, there was actually no zoning when Boundary Street and parts like that developed around the advent of the automobile. So, you know, definitely downtowns are lot line to lot line, and that's historically what we expect. But I just think when you have a corridor like Boundary Street, and of course, I'm sure you may remember or have seen the photographs when it was beautifully lined with palmetto trees. That, I believe it was SCE&G that took them down, wasn't it, Mike?
I can't remember if it was the utilities or if it was actually a road project.
DOT.
I think it may have been a road project, but.
And I didn't mean zoning in Beaufort, I meant zoning as we typically see it came out of Euclid, Ohio in the 1960s or 70s.
1917.
And then fast forward to Beaufort with the we put everything back, we put these big flat lot parking lots in the front. And now I think we're acknowledging that that's sort of separated communities.
Yeah.
And to your point about how buildings and how the built environment inspires people, you look at Boundary Street now, it's not a very inspiring, you don't really want to walk down that corridor because you sort of take your life into your own hands. And so I think what we're trying to do, especially as an extension of the historic district, is to get back to that traditional building method where buildings are accessed, traffic is a little calmer, and it's a safe, inspiring pedestrian environment.
Well, and I'm not sure you would have heard me talk about this 10 years ago, but, you know, we begged the city to keep the zoning historic on both the north and south sides of Boundary Street because the center line of Boundary Street is the boundary of the historic district. And so, you know, we've zoned it 2 different ways now, and so we have different reactions on the north side and the south side, and I never think that really works well in the long run.
There was one dissenting vote, if you remember.
One dissenting vote.
Again, I mean, one proponent for that, only one vote, which was me. I mean, how can you in a historic district with 2 sides of the street totally different?
Yeah, it should go one lot deep.
It's incongruous to do that, and we ended up with pallets, actually.
Right.
But now we've got the dormitories, which could fit in the historic district, so maybe that could be revisited one day. Ricky?
I would echo a lot of Stephen's concerns about some of the recommendations, certainly. I would add too that the research of Joe Minicozy that you referenced is applicable to liner buildings as well as 2-story buildings. And so would certainly say that those liner buildings are important, and even if Publix are some of the most profitable businesses there, even though there's just these small, you know, out parcels or out buildings that are, you know, a Little Caesars and a nail shop. They do great business there. So I think it's important to retain those requirements. The other kind of broad thing that I'll say is that our code, you know, we talked about the evolution of these corridors, and the code is designed to guide that evolution in the way that we want to go, right? And I think you're seeing that on Boundary Street with things like the Breaks for Less and how that corridor is starting to evolve because of the Boundary Street Master Plan and the code that governs development there. So I think we need to definitely keep that in mind as we go forward, is that while it may not look how we want it to and how those pretty pictures and all the plans look, the point is to slowly and incrementally approach that goal, right? And then the last thing that I'll say is I have a little bit of concern over approaching pedestrian and cyclist infrastructure in a way that is nodal. I think the goal of bike and pedestrian infrastructure is to have a fully integrated community, residential, commercial. I should be able to ride my bike safely from Breaks for Less all the way to the Publix on Ladies Island. And that's the goal, is not to have these nodes of walkability and bikeability, but to have a fully integrated city. And we do that through lots of different ways. It doesn't have to be a designated multi-use path. It can be sharrows and things like that. But we need to think about bikeability and walkability as a whole, I think. So we certainly echo Stephen's concerns and add those I mentioned too.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, we'll move on. CDBG, thank you very much.
See you in the morning.
And I'll be empathetic if you want me to. But I don't know that you need me empathetic.
This wasn't an easy effort,
I'm sure
but
it's
it
not.
was,
No.
but I hope it was, you know, if nothing else, it's conversational fodder and.
What was more fun, this one or the branding?
The branding one?
Yeah.
We got to make our own kazoos that time.
We want to come make a zoo. Come make a zoo.
He's gonna add to that too, so.
Okay. Kathy, you doing the CDBG?
Oh, no, but,
No, we got signs.
Oh, we got signs.
I'm sorry.
Signs
I
to be-
was just trying to lighten your load.
appreciate it. Okay. Yes, okay.
I was singing that song, that sign song.
This is a 10 square foot sign. Okay? All right.
You brought him, go.
You everybody got that one?
No, we hold it.
Ken, so
This is a 20 square, this is a 20 square foot sign. So, put that right there. Okay, that's 20 square. So right now, we don't allow monument signs on Boundary, but in T5UC, we allow monument signs that are 10 square feet. And the last time we talked was like, there was, you know, we had someone ask about having them be allowed bigger. So this would be twice as big. Thank you, Nan. Okay, the whiteboard behind you, that's 32 square feet. This seal right here is 7 square feet, a little over 7. The smart board, not just the lid, but the black frame is roughly almost 25 square feet. And then the projector screen, which is kind of blocked, it is 33 and a third square feet. So my question is, I guess there's two things, is having seen these examples, how big of a sign you think is appropriate for a monument sign in T5UC?
tell me our current standard in T5UC, say that again.
Is 10 square feet for a monument sign, which is this one.
And you did the formula, right, David? You did the
Well, and we
formula?
talked about, was it reasonable to allow more if they're based on the number of through lanes? So,
Two lanes and 40
right,
miles an hour.
right, so, you know, should we, you know, allow an additional 10 square feet for any lane past 2 lanes? So, however, 4 lanes would give you a 30-foot sign, which is the whiteboard, or 5 foot for every additional lane would give you back 20 foot, which seems big.
And you're
But,
just talking about T5UC?
Just T5UC. And then the other thing, I'll throw all the questions out there. So if, one, we have to determine whether or not we allow monument signs for new construction on Boundary. Because right now, even though Boundary's T5UC for the most part, at least the part we're talking about, is new monument signs are allowed in the Boundary redevelopment district. So the first question is, do we allow them just like the rest of T5UC? And the second question is, do we just allow it to be 10, or do we allow them to be a little bit bigger if there's multiple lanes? And then my third question, if you do think they should be allowed to be bigger, should the wall sign be reduced by the amount of increase over 10 square feet that you're allowing in the monument sign? Because part of my concern is that suddenly you'll just have a bigger monument sign. Some of the wall signs are pretty big. Right now, they're allowed about one square foot per linear foot.
Like, give me an example. What do you, like Las Galas, they've got the 20-foot, no, yes.
Theirs is about, that one that they've got temporarily on there is 28 square feet.
Okay.
And then they also have,
On their building.
on their building, a wall sign.
And then how big is their wall sign?
I can't remember now when we did it. So
I don't know.
there's several things here, I guess. So I guess the first question for me is, do you want to allow monument signs? I know we're not making a decision here, but you can direct me. T5UC, is that something that we want to treat Boundary Street like we treat the rest of the T5UC zoning?
Boundary Street redevelopment is currently City Hall to Neal Road.
Yeah, I think it goes,
Neil Road.
Neil Road,
yeah.
yeah.
Right, and then does it extend up 170? Any?
Just a little bit there, I think. It just kind of dips down. I think maybe Beaufort Plaza might be in it, so it does dip down.
Okay.
I don't think it goes past
It doesn't go past the Spanish Moss Trail.
the Spanish Moss Trail.
And then from there, does it go to RMX, or is it traditional T5UC?
There's both split. Mostly, as you go past the Spanish Moss Trail along 170, it's T5UC/RMX. So I just assume you guys are trying to, let that transition. Yeah.
Right. So, okay, for T5UC on Boundary,
Mhm.
where are we talking about? Where there might be new construction that would warrant a monument sign? Is there?
Well, like Spring Hill
Hotels.
Suites. Spring Hill Suites might want a monument sign on Boundary.
And there's
Or
several-
period,
there's-
in that district. They
Yeah,
couldn't even have a
right.
monument sign right now. I mean, just
T5UC is currently 10 square feet.
10 square feet.
I think they should be allowed to have a monument sign, but
What did you say?
I think they should be allowed to have a monument sign.
You think they should?
Yeah. I do.
I just think you have to be real cautious about the over-proliferation of monument signs. But
Do we know how many monument signs we have right now on Boundary Street?
Yeah, we did that at one of our other meetings. I had a list of all of them and how big they were, and I'm sorry I didn't
That's all right.
bring all that again. But we have that. We did there's quite a few. I mean, it's surprising how most of the businesses have monument signs because it predated, I think, if I remember right, it predated the UDO. I think the UDO, forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, I think the UDO is pretty much like it is now, about 10 square feet, and not allowed in the redevelopment district, or
it's
at least.
probably Boundary Street mass.
I think it was from 90s. I think some of these buildings were like from the 90s, and they predated the UDO, and that's how they got them, and some of them are pretty big, as you can see.
Well, part of the issue in the redevelopment is with the setbacks, right? Because what's the setback requirement? Or
I believe there's no difference I don't think there's anything different because it's Boundary Street redevelopment, so it's 0 to 15.
Just like
New.
5UC.
Right. So if you look now, most of, and which is interesting, I'm guessing that they thought that buildings up near the front of the street wouldn't need a monument sign because they're gonna be somewhere between 0 and 15 feet.
Right.
There's not a lot of room to put a monument sign in there. So but that's just me
But like the
assuming they're-
hotels have how many feet? Those two new ones, how many feet do they have?
Well, the Spring Hill Suites was developed under the UDO, so I'm not sure what its setback is, but because I know it started under the UDO, and we honored that.
because it's developed under the UDO, do the sign standards from the UDO apply? Or-
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So everything once you start under that, as long as you meet the vesting requirements, you're moving forward.
Right.
Then that's what we honor, so that we're not changing the rules on you midstream kind of thing.
I feel like I need to get in the car and go look at every single sign.
And to make it even more complicated, I didn't bring this up today, but one of the things we need to think about is, especially when we start having development that is off of the main corridor, but it's set back. And we need to think about, we don't allow off-premise signs, but the way we've been trying to manage that is through master sign plans. But in a way, you almost need a monument sign.
The sign so they know
So you
that
know
that
that-
is off.
Or you need a smartphone with a GPS.
Or you
app.
need a, yeah, exactly, that's true. Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah. So, I mean, that's exactly right. We need to think about this in light of how people find things today. And I think that's fair. And so maybe you don't need these big signs, you know.
Well, and my argument's always been, at some point, you have, I lived in Tampa, Florida if you drive up Highway 19, you talk about visual clutter.
Well, those are billboards.
I mean, well, it's everything. It's billboards, but it's also monument signs, it's pole signs,
Roof
it's
signs, if I'm not
neon signs, it's flashing signs. I mean, you're driving down the thing and all it is
I agree.
is signs, and I don't, it doesn't really help me find the business.
And the irony is, you can't see them. There's so many signs out in front of the businesses.
Right.
You can't really see them until you're at some angle that it's not being blocked by the other signs. So I think that's exactly right. We don't want that sign clutter, and the irony is, the sign's not really helping you from a distance.
Right. And I mean, I'll use my business as an example. I'm a half a mile off of two main corridors, and I'm in destination businesses, admittedly, but rarely have folks complain that they have trouble finding us. And you have to come try to find us to get back
You
there.
didn't hear from the ones that couldn't find you.
I think,
I'm not saying they don't call.
I'm just joking.
I'm not saying they don't call. Absolutely.
I think you need a bigger sign.
Well, my staff thinks I need a sign out on the main drags, right? Because I think, again, we have this perception that just because we put signs out, that that's going to drive a tremendous amount of business. But I just think we have to be careful about the,
I agree. So, it's funny because we kind of talked about when we were leaning like, well, if there's more lanes, we need a bigger sign. But then when you look at it, I just wanted y'all to see like, well, what does that really mean, So right now, this is what's allowed. But then theoretically, if we allowed 5 more feet for every additional lane past 2, it'd be this big.
right.
If you had 2 more lanes, right?
But this is on 4 lanes right here.
No, this is just in T5, whether it's a 2-lane, a 4-lane.
4-lane.
This is,
That's
if it's
what the code
allowed,
says.
it's just, the wrinkle is Boundary Tree Redevelopment District doesn't allow monument signs for new business.
My personal view is a monument sign's purpose is for multi-tenant places more than an individual sign, because it keeps it down to a sign rather than everybody having.
Well, but then you take, the owner of Los Galos, he believes, he invested his money in that building and that business, and he wanted his monument sign, which is a single. And I understand that. I mean, if I were investing my money on a business on Boundary Street and wanted a monument sign, I feel like I should be able to have
Well,
one.
I'm going to sort of agree in that I think, so there's a difference in the new construction, right, has got to be built 0 to 15 feet.
All right.
And so a 20-foot monument sign in front of a 0 to 15-foot setback, I think is going to look weird.
It's gonna be too big.
And so I'm uncomfortable with that. But Los Galos, on the other hand, which is, how far are they set back off?
Probably 60 feet.
60 feet?
Yeah, probably, I'm just guessing.
And so in that case, I think of, a reasonable, and I haven't defined reasonable, but I think of a monument sign in that case is probably okay. So is there a way for us to
Yeah, I mean,
grandfather buildings that have the setbacks, that have monument signs in somehow and allow monuments, but for new construction, it's gonna be right up?
yeah, we could.
What do you think, David?
I think these are all good ideas.
Are you running for council?
So I'm trying to keep my job. And So, no, I think these are good, and I think that's a good point about the monument. And the other thing that also we'll talk about, we can talk about another day, is when you have them for master signs where the monument is serving more than one business, you are allowed to increase the size of that monument sign, the way the code is now. I think that's the important thing is, you know, how big do you want a monument sign, period, whether you allow it because the building is set back or not. Also, right now, the way the code is, when you change, when the tenant changes, when the ownership changes, you have to bring it into code. So technically, the Applebee's big brick thing should have been torn down.
Right.
And you actually have a period of time, I think it's 30 days to actually remove the non-conforming sign. So, you know, if you don't do these things, you'll never, ever get the city you want to look the way it is. If you don't, you allow people to be grandfathered out of fairness, but when it changes ownership, you're like, well, that's usually when we say the grandfathering go, you know, we protected the original owner, but now you're a new owner, you should be able to follow the code. But so there's a lot of pieces here as far as what you want to do.
I would personally like, I mean, and not that I'm pushing the can down the road, but I would personally like to get in the car.
Okay.
I would get in the car and go down Boundary and look at every single monument sign and look at every possibility or before I, you know,
Okay.
I mean, I feel like I need to really, that's just me.
Is there something you want me to bring?
Imagine build out too.
Huh?
Recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, you want me to say, what would this look like, what would that look like?
Right. I mean, and
But
we're,
realistically, the new construction can't be as far as setback. So anything coming in new, their setback requirements would be 0 to 15.
Correct.
So the monument in new construction is a whole different story than the grandfather in old construction.
Correct.
So
Think
that's
about
really
breaks for
how we
less.
look at it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You know, breaks
think
for
about
less.
what? Breaks
Think about
for
the
less.
breaks for less.
Right.
It's, you
They
know,
don't
it's
need a monument.
right up against this, and so the signage is on their,
Right.
on their building, and
Right.
it looks.
But if they're back, it's a different story. Once again,
Correct.
flexibility, I think we should,
But they wouldn't be back.
If it's new
If it's
construction,
new construction.
they can't be back. They have to
And
be
it
0 to
only can
15.
be old.
Right.
Or
But-
if
but
you
what
grant the variance 0 to
about-
16 and a half.
okay, but
Yeah.
what about,
Exactly.
what about if your example of, if it's back behind another, you know, if there's a lot, say behind the hotel or,
That's an off-premise.
Yeah, yeah, and here's the thing, I think, I understand that, you know, you'll never get it to look the way you want it to look if you, like, but let's say you had a shopping center that someone bought, it's vacant, and they bought it, but there was a monument sign out front. So you know, right now, Boundary Street doesn't allow you to have a monument sign, so they would have to tear it down. So I think what you're saying is, you kind of see that you need a monument sign if
you
you're building
need
a
a
setback.
monument sign. Okay, go down 170, and there's Walmart, and then there's TJ Maxx. They have to have a monument sign there because of the trees block the entire visual of the building. I look at that monument sign just to look at it, to see
Yeah.
who's back there.
Right.
But you wouldn't know what was back there
Correct.
if you didn't have a monument sign.
Correct.
So, you know, I think there's situations where.
So, it's interesting, do y'all remember why you didn't allow that on the boundary redevelopment?
Yeah, I don't understand, it
The
doesn't make
sign,
sense to
the
me.
monument sign?
Yeah.
Why did we not allow a monument sign?
It was to
No,
reduce
Billy's called the
clutter.
sign miser, and he doesn't like signs. No signs anywhere.
It was to reduce.
I think
That's
to,
why you
Clutter.
can have one in your business.
on this particular issue, that's what I hear David asking, is that there's been, and that's what brought this to light, was the issue with Los Galos.
Mhm.
And that's what I hear him asking is this something that you want through an action of council to revisit, or is it something that you want him to move on from?
Well,
In the Boundary Street redevelopment
I think we need
district,
to
right?
revisit it personally. Mine's my own personal opinion.
I think we have to
That's
visit
just-
some
I'm one
exceptions
person.
to existing construction, because the new construction answers its own question, in my mind's eye. So,
Yeah,
I think it's the grandfather.
And I think we've
discussion.
done two things here. I understand the grandfathering and how at some point it's got to stop. But in this case, we've radically changed the development pattern instructions for the corridor. In other words, it used to be the buildings were set back. So now we've said buildings can't be set back, and new buildings can't have a monument sign. And if the ownership changes, you can't have a monument sign. However, there's still buildings that are set back, which kind of need a monument sign. So I think we could, that, when you were asking me to go, I think that down that path is that, should we write something that modifies the non-contributing as far as setback buildings?
Okay, so let me ask you a question. So Dick Stewart owns, you know, the L-shaped one, right? He sells it, the Bilo in the old.
Okay,
floor.
gotcha.
He sells it.
Right.
In the code, that would mean that that monument sign would have to come down. What if you bought that?
Which the new town centers
Wouldn't,
have had.
wouldn't you want
I need to make
a monument sign there?
They have their own master plan.
They're in a
I think I might have to make, yeah, I think they
Yeah,
are.
they have their own master
It might be in the, yeah, they might be in a PUD that allows to have that sign.
In a plan, in a, okay.
PUD,
Yeah.
yeah, Plan Unit Development. I think there's a different,
There is.
Okay.
so, yeah.
Well, I think there should be some consideration for buildings that are set back. And I understand your concern about when, you know, it's grandfathering and if we're gonna try to make a transition. But the argument would be that if you look at the buildings that are set far back, I mean, the Outback is maybe one of the new, Outback, the Applebee's is probably one of the newest buildings along the corridor. And at some point, those buildings will be raised and there'll be new construction that goes up on those sites. And at that time, that's when it will reset. It will be the 0 to 16.5-foot requirement. And they won't be allowed to have a monument sign. But I think in the meantime, some flexibility to allow some monument sign for existing buildings that have some setback limit of some reasonable 10-foot size is probably appropriate.
So, okay, good. And I'll work up something for that. Now, should I go with 10 foot for a single building? And knowing that, you know, if you have a monument for a master plan for multiple tenants, it can be bigger. But for a single business, do you want it to stay at 10?
Like Las Galas, we're talking about.
Right, don't use that as an example.
Okay, so
Well,
then-
it's an interesting point, because if we could allow you to keep the monument sign, but we're asking you to bring it into code, which is 10 square feet. Because right now, I think it's 8 feet tall,
It's 20-something square feet.
and it's 28. The actual sign itself and the monument that holds it
It's 20.
is 8 feet by 10 feet, or 10 feet by 8. It's huge. So, I mean, that's big. That's not kind of fitting the mode of
I
what you
would
guys
lean
want.
more towards the smaller.
I would-
Unless it's multi-use.
I would stick with that.
Okay.
Unless it's multi-businesses.
Okay.
I think where we get to the serious issue, because I hope one day Bilo, and I hope one day Staples, all have minor buildings, because that creates a sense of place.
Mm-hmm.
At which case, if we're gonna hide your building, we have to at least help people understand
What's
you're
there?
there, you're there.
And that brings up an interesting point, when you have these shopping centers or town centers, whatever you want to call them, and you have liner buildings, and your liner buildings are 0 to 15 feet from the front, there's no place to put the center monument.
That's the developer's issue.
Okay, I'm just saying though, so.
Okay. So
Again,
just-
I have a lot of empathy for business owners, because I am one.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah, I
understand
do
the blood,
too.
sweat, and tears and investment that go into these enterprises. But if you think that the value of your business, or that the life or death of your business depends on an off-premises sign, there are deeper issues in your business than the signage.
I agree.
Because you've not created enough value where people see that in your business.
Right.
And I hate that for people. I hate to see people close businesses, but it's the reality of the marketplace.
And this is what helps me, because I get all these arguments, right? And so when I know, no, this is what council wants, it's easy. I mean, it's not fun, but it's easy. Okay?
At least
So,
it's finite.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, and this is the tension between this traditional, development pattern that we've been in for 40 or 50 years. And then, as T was saying, and I think you said, as we transition, right? And so it has to be incremental, and we're gonna keep finding these issues.
For pushing, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I remember the whole, Cindy, was it the Ocean View that had the Coca-Cola sign on it? Right downtown, the
Oh,
whole
yeah,
side of the
the whole
building.
side of the building.
I was just
All those
thinking
little metal
about-
banners they used to have on
It
the.
was painted.
No, the really, the way
Oh,
they
it's
used to
painted.
paint the really big
It was
signs,
painted on
was
the
so
brick,
cool.
on the brick.
No, you can't do that anymore.
Well, and you'll never have historic signs if you keep tearing them all down.
Pardon?
You'll never have a historic sign again in Beaufort if you keep tearing them down.
What's an historic sign? You mean as
One
far
that-
as the
one
painted
that
ones on the
is-
painted on the walls?
Is an appropriate sign that stands the test of time, you know, it's built of hard materials. A lot of signs are being saved across America now.
Yeah, they're
And they're
iconic.
expensive.
Yeah,
Actually,
they're like,
they had
they're
that on the
iconic.
preservation.
They're iconic.
Yeah, they had that on that preservation.
I
presentation
remember
about
Maryland
sign.
Fried Chicken.
Yeah, we had that
We
conversation.
saved that, let them save that sign.
Just as a note here, we have one more discussion plus
Yeah.
an executive session, and we only have 30 minutes, so.
Okay. Thank you, David.
Okay?
You good?
Thanks so much.
You give me
All right.
guidance?
I'll go
You got
fast.
as clear as mud?
Yep, I know, I think I know what you want, and also
This
gives you,
was better. We did better this time.
I think I know what you want.
I want to still ride down.
Yeah, let me go this way.
Well, it's an ordinance change, so it requires a public hearing and two readings, so.
Lots of work to do.
Okay.
I reminded when we did the Highway 21.
Let's move on to
expansion
CDBG.
Riggs Island, that we removed all the line
You moved what?
signs.
Oh, okay. CDBG, the window is opening for,
She's doing a public hearing at 7 o'clock, correct?
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
So what Bill wanted was us to look at the types of projects that perhaps could be funded through the CDBG, and get from you guys what you think are the top 3 things that you would maybe pursue.
Remember the 10% match.
Saying we should go for the more expensive ones because we're gonna have to pay more.
Kathy, you want to come to the table?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have it in my mind.
You were just saying the 10% match, so.
Oh.
Keep her at the
That's
top.
right.
The first.
Well, I mean, looking and putting a project on the needs list does not necessarily mean when you're gonna get it to.
Right.
You know, you've got a couple of years to come up with a match, so.
Yep.
And we have the low to moderate issue as well, so. Stormwater above and beyond. Bossy Oaks is pretty much out. unless-
Mhm.
I'm not sure whether Pigeon Point qualifies, probably not.
Yeah, I mean, but I think, you know, if there's areas like that we can then see the numbers and go look and see if they meet the LMI and all the other
First
things.
thing that comes to my mind, period, is stormwater for a while,
Right.
until we see our way towards how we're gonna get there.
Maybe the feds will let us use the opportunity zone census tracts that are blighted and depressed to qualify for
Good point, good
CDBG
point.
money.
Yeah, I don't think so.
All right. Are there any major changes in the program in previous years?
I don't know, you know, if you're, like, I remember last year, because we had some CDB grants that we were still working, and we didn't even list any and pursue any grants last year. I did put in, from the previous year, the list that you guys looked at work session or at council. It's in here.
There was a 2018, you did the 2018.
Yeah, it was
If I could
2018.
add- If I could
Yeah.
add to that,
Sure.
I know with Greenlawn closing out, we tend to like our infrastructure, because the ones we've got from Mossy Oaks is more stormwater related than infrastructure, so.
So, I mean, it runs the gamut. It's just whether or not we've got no areas that would meet the other criteria for the CDBG.
Staff have suggestions?
David, isn't there a list on the back of the packet?
Well, that was the list from
That's 2018 's
2018, and I also, you know, put in the current CIP. At the risk of this, it's really, when we do the retreat and the comp plan, and we look at all our projects, you know, if we start seeing, oh, these are the ones that we want to go forward with, we could see that this actually would qualify for CDBG. So we're kind of
We're right before that.
We're a little bit before that. And
Next
we
week.
need to have the discussions about what are the things we feel like we need to do in the city
But do we
and
need-
where those are.
Do we need this before?
I'm not sure.
We go through the
That's a
city
good question. I don't think so. I just think Bill, wanted a general idea. If you had ideas like, there's all kind, there's downtown streetscape improvements, which we've done. Are those things that we want to continue doing? I don't know that we finished all those projects. Brownfield, we don't really have, I don't think we have any brownfields around here, do we, in the city limits? Public safety facilities, there's transportation-oriented public facilities. I know we've been talking about things about the transportation and, from up here down to workplaces and, I just think I feel like I'm not really sure. This is just kind of a general idea of something that he wanted y'all to look at generally.
And
I don't have anything specific that I can say, here's my project, but I will, I think, coming out of the retreat, I'll be able to say,
Say
hey,
we'll have more.
yes, I can probably have a more,
I think we all
Yeah.
will.
And when do we have to, because we have to formally sort of adopt a few priorities, right?
yeah, I think that's what Bill thought, we had to have some priorities for the city, and, so,
And do we know when that is? We
Well,
don't know.
we do submit a list every year.
right, we
Yeah.
send them a list.
Yeah.
But
We're in
the
that
que-
window
the-
now.
The question is.
But
Do
we
you
don't
know
have
how
to do it
long the
tonight.
window is?
She's just gonna be describing these
Sabrina, who's
tonight,
doing
going
it?
through the various levels and what's
So
available.
we're opening
and
the
that sort of
window, so
thing.
we-
So I
There's
think
the
you've got
neighborhood
time.
revitalization, obviously, I think there's opportunities.
Yeah.
So, yes, and that's what I was thinking too. I mean, we've got housing, infrastructure support, affordable housing, so demolition and clearance of vacant dilapidated properties. I mean, there's some things on there that I think we probably do have some needs for and that we may qualify for. So we could, general terms, we know, I guess we can have some idea of what they are. We just don't have the specific project listed, perhaps.
Right.
And it looks like, depending on what route you try to go, your first application needs, the deadline needs to be in about 16th of March, so.
Okay.
So we've got
That's
a
what I
We've got a little bit of time.
Yeah,
Not
we've got-
too much
Not
time.
much.
We've got, yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
And
No.
Okay.
you and Matt went to the thing with them at the county last
Oh,
week?
yeah, no question.
I went to it.
You went to it, Matt?
Matt did.
You wanna add anything of
No,
what you learned
no,
from
no,
that,
no.
or?
There was something that we didn't already know that came out of that.
Okay.
Okay, if we're finished with that, do I have a motion?
Before the motion, Mayor, at Bill's request, he would like your permission to cancel next week's work session in lieu of the Tuesday day at the retreat.
Here, here.
It was a great idea.
I would
You have to
anyway.
do that by
That's the film festival,
any
right?
formal vote to do that upstairs, or?
It's a work session.
Work session.
It's just
Just
a
a
work
work
session.
session.
So it's just us.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
That's the
Yeah,
18th.
I think he's doing it.
Just give a
That's the
direction.
18th.
Yes, sir.
Was that the opening night of the film
It
festival
is,
also?
it is.
Okay, do I have a motion?
Mr. Mayor, I move pursuant to Title 30, Chapter 4 of the Supplement 2 of South Carolina Code of Law that we enter executive session for discussion regarding purchase, sale of property.
Someone going upstairs?
Give a second.
Have a second, those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Sorry.
Okay, I got a technical